Hello, I'm Dr. Amaleya Goneos-Malka. Welcome to Womanity-Women in Unity, the show that celebrates women's milestone achievements in their struggle for liberation, self-emancipation, human rights, democracy, and much more. Joining us today for our series on women in the judiciary is Judge Jacqueline Henriques, who is a permanent judge of the KwaZulu-Natal division of the High Court. We open today's program with a quote from Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve as a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And she said, "We don't accomplish anything in this world alone. And whatever happens is the result of the whole tapestry of one's life and all the weavings of individual threads from one to another that create something." When I think about this statement in the context of the law, it reminds me of the enabling structures that women have through hard-gained rights, which allows us the freedom to live our individual lives as threads and contribute to the fabric of society. So welcome to the show, Judge Henriques.
Thank you, Dr. Goneos-Malka. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with you and your listeners.
Reflecting on your journey, more than a decade ago, you were appointed as a judge in KwaZulu-Natal's division of the High Court in 2011. Before that, you were in private practice. You were employed by the state in some very interesting roles, such as High Court and Magistrates Court litigation involving all government departments and dealing with matters referred by the Asset Forfeiture Unit. Tell us what triggered your interest to go into law.
Well, actually, law wasn't my first choice. I come from a family of teachers, and that is what I wanted to do. My father was reluctant for me to follow his footsteps and discouraged me from embarking on a teaching career. So I thought I would outsmart him. I registered for a B.Proc degree at the time because that's the degree I was accepted for at the university. And I planned on changing midway to a BA and then branching out and doing a Bachelor of Education. Fortunately, when I registered for the B.Proc degree, I loved it. I was hooked. The bug caught me, and the rest, as they say, is history. But also what transpired whilst I was studying was that a family member of mine was attacked and went through a very traumatic experience. And apart from watching her deal with the trauma of the attack, there was also the secondary trauma that she went through, having to go through court appearance after court appearance. And I watched her do this for a period of almost 3 years until the matter was finalized.
Wow.
And that made me determined to make a difference and not let anyone go through that again, and provide support. So my initial choice was to become a prosecution, but obviously life had other plans for me. I didn't go the prosecution route, and then during the course of my B.Proc decided that I wanted to start practice as an advocate, and that's the route I took, hence the BA LLB degrees. And I've also, to a large extent, been motivated by a desire to help. I've always wanted to help, and this was my way of making a contribution.
One of the things you highlighted with your family member going through the traumatic experience that she did was this idea that those experiences are relived every time the topic surfaces, every time that they go through a court hearing. And I can only imagine how overwhelming that must be to just have this sort of delay of justice on a continual basis. And it's not something that I'd previously really given much thought to, but it must have tremendous impact on an individual's well-being.
It does, because they've already been through that physical and mental trauma. Just getting them to make a statement and report it is a huge ask. But then you ask them to get up every morning and come to court and sit at court waiting in the hope that they get to testify. And that in itself, I think, is a harrowing experience for anyone. But on occasion, they don't get to testify. So apart from going through the secondary trauma of having to testify, they wait. And for whatever reason, they don't get to testify. So they come back the next day and the next day. And for me, that has got to be among the hugely emotionally challenging experiences that anyone has to go through. For an adult, I think it's easier to deal with. But when you're dealing with children, it's far more difficult for them to go through that experience. And although we have court preparation officers who assist them and social workers, I don't know that we do enough, which is why as a judicial officer, where it is within my control, I try and ensure that we deal with these witnesses as expeditiously as possible so that once they testify, they then get to go home, go through whatever trauma counseling they need, and try and move on and put this behind them. And I'm not naive to think that they'll put it behind them. I think people do put it behind them. They just learn coping mechanisms to deal with it.
You've given us a perspective of witnesses coming to the stand and victims. On the other side, how do you deal with these situations? Because you're exposed to these traumas as well. Is there a kind of debriefing that happens?
I've been on a workshop where you're taught to decompress. As a judge, you also have colleagues who've had a similar experience, who you can talk to, who've mentored you and who've been through this. I've also learned coping mechanisms. So I try and leave work at work. I try and set boundaries. The job of a judge isn't an 8 to 5 job. As you know, it's 24/7. But I try and exercise. I try and do meditational exercises. I try and eat healthy and exercise to deal with those pressures. And over time, you learn coping mechanisms. And I think what also helps is that in our division, unlike with the magistracy or the lower court judiciary, you don't deal with criminal work day in and day out. Our work schedules are such that you do a criminal session and you alternate that with a civil session. And that also gives you a break from being in a criminal matter and having to deal with it on an ongoing basis. So that does help to some extent.
Yeah, those decompression skills, I think, must be handy in literally any field.
They are.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you've done a variety of different roles. Can you tell us potentially about some of the obstacles that you've encountered as a woman building your career, and importantly, how you overcame them?
When I started my career, I wanted to gain as much experience as possible. I didn't have family members or friends who were in the legal sphere. So getting that experience into what actually goes on in practice was a bit difficult. But what I did was I volunteered at a firm. I literally knocked on doors and said to attorneys, I'm happy to volunteer my services for no remuneration, just so that I could get experience. Some are reluctant because of confidentiality issues, but some, having been through that as they progressed through their career, understood what I was trying to do. So fortunately, a particular firm let me come in on a weekend and holidays and allowed me to just sit in and listen on consultations, to go to court, to do research. And I would get feedback, which was very invaluable. I also worked part-time at a major retailer from my school days right until I did my articles of clerkship. So that also helped me financially. When I started my practice as well, we were able to negotiate 6 months rent-free with the landlord, which also helped. So from that perspective, it helped. It helped me set up my practice. My brother had a business, so he, after the 6-month rent-free period, paid my rent for 3 months, which also helped me get my practice going until, I got my fee started coming in. I also sat in court a lot because of the kind of exposure that I had. I hadn't had exposure to commercial work. So I sat in court. I followed silks down to court and just sat in and listened to matters that were going on in court. I also volunteered my services for drafting and no remuneration, just so that I would get the experience and the feedback from them.
You know, you have this sense of ambition, and that where there is a will, there's a way, that you volunteered your services to gain the experiences, that you leveraged your negotiation skills in terms of negotiating the rent-free, and then kind of that, I guess, social capital or familial responsibility to have your brother to help fund another 3 months. And all of these endeavors just really show merits in terms of a person's ambition and drive forwards, that you keep going no matter what. There's always an opportunity. There's always a way. It might not be the direct route that one is expecting, but it's your way.
Yes. My motto is persevere and never give up.
Absolutely. Very, very clear in what you've said. Thinking about your career for a moment, you mentioned that you were sitting in, the court sessions of criminal cases as well as civil cases. Can you tell us about a couple of cases that have impacted on you the most, that you've presided over?
Okay, a few come to mind. For me, every case has an impact, because not necessarily on me, but for a litigant, because it's important to them. But for me, there have been 2 family law matters that have stood out. The first one recognized the right of an unmarried father to have his surname reflected on the birth certificate of his son. As you know, it took a while for the rights of unmarried fathers in respect of children born out of wedlock to be statutorily recognized. The second was a matter more recently, which involved a contact and care dispute, where there was an application for a carte blanche order of access to medical reports and psychiatric reports. That was a tough one, because I had to find a way to balance 2 competing constitutional rights, one being the right to privacy, and the second, which says in Section 28 of the Constitution, which says the rights of children are of paramount importance. That for me was a challenging matter. Then there was a criminal matter which involved a child who had been kidnapped and murdered. There was no direct evidence against the accused, and the state in that matter relied solely on circumstantial evidence. The evidence involved relying on that of an expert, an entomologist, to establish the likely time of death, which together with the cell phone evidence was necessary to complete the mosaic of evidence for the circumstantial evidence to be complete and to secure the conviction of the accused. The matter also attracted considerable attention, public interest as well, because the public and members of society were involved in the search for him for a period in excess of 3 months. So that was quite not only a challenging from an emotional perspective, but also from a legal perspective, because the evidence of the entomologist was crucial to, as I say, the state establishing and discharging the onus based solely on circumstantial evidence. The last matter was a maritime law matter, which related to a practice directive which only applied in our KwaZulu-Natal division. It wasn't something that had been implemented and practiced in all 9 provinces. It's a practice directive that's been in existence for a very long period of time. And one of the issues I had to deal with in the matter related to that. I was pleased about it because I hadn't had much exposure to maritime law, but it went on appeal, and the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld my judgment. So I was quite pleased about that.
In those four matters, you've really demonstrated the variety of different types of cases that you deal with. Given your experiences, what advice would you give to upcoming law students who aspire to be judges or just work in the legal profession?
For me, I tell them to work hard, sacrifice, and remain determined, and never give up. Focus on your goals, try and get as much practical experience as possible. University teaches you the theory, but if you want to be successful in the legal profession, you have to get that practical experience. Go to court, assist at advice desks or community centers, participate in the projects of the Legal Practice Council, as well as your bar council. I think that would be the advice I'd give.
So you've spoken about theory, that's the aspect that will come through from university. You spoke about practice. You've also spoken about the idea of participating in projects that the fraternity of law is involved with. Are there any key qualities or skills that you think are important for a successful career in law?
I can speak from the perspective of being a judicial officer. And I think it requires a combination of skills, qualities, and personal attributes. For me, some of the crucial ones are the following: impartiality and independence, an ability to remain unbiased and be an independent thinker, but also independent in your decision making. Secondly, strong analytical and critical thinking. One must have a capacity to analyze complex legal issues, evaluate the evidence that's presented, and make sound judgments. Thirdly, you must have excellent communication skills, an ability to clearly articulate your thoughts, both verbally and in writing. One of the most important ones, I think, is integrity and ethics, an unwavering commitment to uphold the law and maintain the highest ethical standards. Empathy, an ability to understand and not only manage one's emotions, but also empathize with others and understand the emotions at play, especially when you have litigants in person who appear in your court. A strong work ethic and an ability to manage your time. You must have a capacity to handle heavy workloads, be able to prioritize tasks and manage your time effectively. Goes without saying, a knowledge of the law and legal principles, and an ability to remain calm under pressure, a capacity to maintain your composure in high stress situations, a respect and empathy for diverse perspectives, an ability to consider and respect different viewpoints, cultures, and backgrounds. Also, be committed to continuous development. Continuing legal education as a judicial officer is important. And I think as a judge, you must have the ability to work collaboratively with others, especially with your colleagues. Good case management skills and an ability to adapt to changing circumstances. I think those for me would be some of the key qualities that you would need.
And I wonder how many of those are actually in job descriptions, because these are crucial soft skills.
They are, but I think we don't verbalize them. We do them, but you don't actually realize that these are qualities and skills that you need, that actually on a day-to-day basis you are doing it. And I think that would apply equally to most people out there in whatever their chosen profession or career is. If you maintain them, I think it's a key to success.
Judge Henriques, our world changes constantly, and correspondingly, the law does as well. In your opinion, what would you say have been some of the most important recent laws or reforms that have been passed that are in the best interests of women?
For me, the most recent development has been the changes and amendments to the laws in relation to domestic violence legislation. In the fight against gender-based violence, the legislature has made, in my view, commendable amendments to various legislation. Stricter bail conditions are now imposed on a person who's charged with domestic violence offences, and harsher sentences are now prescribed for offences relating to gender-based violence. Some of these amendments, which have now come into force on the 14th of April 2023, were substantial. And I'm just going to highlight a few, if you don't mind.
Please.
The Act has expanded on the definition of what constitutes domestic violence. So some of the acts of domestic violence now include, in addition to the physical abuse, economic abuse, spiritual abuse, controlling behavior, harassment, intimidation, elder abuse, and related person abuse, to name a few. In my view, the expansion of the definition enhances protection afforded to victims. The Act now also requires the community to play an active role in stopping the scourge of domestic violence. It's mandatory for the public to report acts or reasonable suspicions of domestic violence, especially committed against children, disabled people, and the elderly. And it also criminalizes the failure of a person to report such abuse. Certain functionaries also have that responsibility, is now set out in sections 2A and 2B. It's capital A and capital B of the Act. Victims of domestic violence no longer have to wait for the court to open or for a weekday to seek help from the court, as you can apply for a protection order outside of court hours. And it also, very interestingly in my view, makes provision for the issuing of a domestic violence safety monitoring notice. This provides protection to a victim of domestic abuse who lives together with his or her alleged abuser. And when such a notice is issued, the South African Police Service will be required to regularly communicate with the victim to ensure his or her safety. I think for me, those are the key.
Judge Henriques, how does that work if you're living with your spouse and they have been abusing you? How? Because, I mean, the reality is, as you mentioned, one of the elements is about economic abuse, as mental abuse as well.
Yes.
So in a situation where people are living together, whether they're married or not, how does that work?
I'll give you an example, which I've had personal experience from. So what's transpired is in certain communities, you find that a husband and wife and their children will move in with his or her parents. So, for example, the parents live upstairs and they live downstairs. She doesn't have access to an alternate place to stay.
Yeah.
So what will then happen is he will be required to move upstairs, she and the children downstairs. So that's one way of effectively enforcing it. That's an example that I can think of, which I hope answers the question.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of all of the changes to the Act. I wasn't aware of the fact that there is now an onus on community to responsibly report any form of abuse that they feel may be taking place, which calls to mind, is there enough media awareness about these changes?
Honestly, I'm not certain. I know that prior to the amendments being published, it's circulated. There is consultation that does take place and input, but as in relation to these new changes and whether they've been made public and the public has been aware, I can't tell you that they have. I don't know what the answer to that is. I know in our family courts, certainly they will be made aware of this. And I know what the courts tend to do is, as new amendments come out, they put up banners at the various courts, which just highlights and brings that to the attention of potential victims.
Thank you for sharing. I do think it's important, and hopefully part of Womanity's broadcast will get to some of the ears that need to hear what you've just said. Staying on this topic, there are a number of international gender equality instruments, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5, talks to gender equality and women's empowerment, which really confirm that women's participation and representation in decision-making bodies is a human right. Yet, despite this right, women frequently are still underrepresented in professional careers. How do you think we can use policies like these or others to effectively drive change and support women?
For me, the starting point would be to use gender inclusive language in policies, to conduct a gender analysis, to identify the potential for impact on women, and in that way, one can address disparities. I think it's imperative that we encourage the participation of more women in policy development and in the actual decision-making process. It's important to increase the consultation with women in the policy-making process, and to also address factors like race and class to identify and cater for the challenges experienced by diverse women, because we all come from different backgrounds and have different life experiences. Also, when making policy or implementing policy, you have to ensure that sufficient data and research is collated to effectively address women's needs. I also think it's important to encourage collaboration and partnerships with women's organizations and various stakeholders to ensure maximum impact. For me, it's not so much about the policy making and passing it, but what we tend not to do is establish mechanisms for accountability. We don't monitor implementation enough, and we don't regularly evaluate the policy that's there, because I think there's a tendency, as with any legislation, once it's passed, well, we've achieved our goal. And I think that contributes to why there's a slow change, and sometimes things don't change at all.
You're right. There's a whole value chain that needs to embrace the mechanisms and an entire change management structure, to borrow language from the corporate sector, to ensure that legislation is not just a passing of an act, and that it actually is implemented and we see material changes on the ground. You're listening to Womanity-Women in Unity, and today we're talking to Judge Jacqueline Henriques, who is a permanent judge of the KwaZulu-Natal Division of the High Court. We would love to receive your comments on Twitter at WomanityTalk. Judge Henriques, when I wrote my questions, I hadn't had any interaction with you. And in the next question I'm going to ask you, now I think I understand more of the reasoning, but nonetheless, I wanted to say for our listeners, you're a member of both the KwaZulu-Natal Society of Advocates as well as the Northern Cape Society of Advocates, and you became a member of the Kimberley Bar. Why did you join two associations?
What transpired was that I had set up my practice here in Durban, and that's how I joined the KwaZulu-Natal Society of Advocates. But whilst I was a state attorney, I was actively involved in asset forfeiture work through their offices. That was a department that I headed. I was also involved in the legislation. And what then transpired was that when they were looking to set up an office in the Northern Cape, I was approached with a view to just assisting them for 6 months to start the office and get it up and running, and to assist in moving applications and conscientizing people about asset forfeiture work. And fortunately, I can speak Afrikaans, which is a language that dominantly used there. So that was an added advantage for me. And I was only supposed to go there for 6 months, set up the office, get it up and running, and come back. And as you know, I ended up being there for 9 years. I I set up the office, but then I continued to do their work. I continued to train advocates that were brought into the office, to train policemen and work with them. And then I was approached by attorneys in Kimberley to say, well, you're here, can't you take on some other work? And I said, okay, fine, not a problem. And one of the requirements for me being there was to join the bar in Kimberley. And I must just add, there were only 6 of us there at the time. And that's how I joined the bar, and I remained there. And I practiced both. I did work, civil work, mainly litigation work and labor work. So that's how I ended up having a dual set of chambers.
Within these organizations, one of the things that I found particularly interesting from a career development perspective is the value of professional networking. But it does seem to be an area of weakness for some women. Based on your experiences, how can women become more effective at building and nurturing their professional networks?
The first thing, let me say at the outset, is that we as women must help each other. I think that's sorely lacking. And I think because there are few opportunities for women, there's a mindset, well, if I help you, I'm going to lose that work. And I think that's the first thing we must do. We must help each other, support each other, and advance each other. We each bring different skills to a profession. And I believe that there's a role for all of us to play. I think you must identify goals and clarify what you want to achieve through networking. Build relationships based on trust and mutual support. Take the initiative to connect with others, but also to connect new professionals entering the profession with others. Have a listening ear, pay attention, and help where you can. And I also think it's important to create a diverse network across industries and sectors. Regularly stay in touch with one another. Make use of the organizations. There are a number of organizations, BLA, NADAL, SAULA, South African Association for International Women Judges. There are also private partnerships that you can engage in. There is a push, in my view, for and outside the legal career, because in as much as you are an attorney or an advocate or a judge, there are other spheres that you can get involved in, or that people want to introduce you to advance. So, for example, the financial sector is trying to encourage programs to get partnerships going, investment in continuing legal education. And I think that's one way that we can build those networks. I also don't think one must underestimate social responsibility and how that also helps you build those networks, whether it's volunteering at a soup kitchen, a church function, a charity. Those networks are invaluable in my view. Apart from giving back, there's a lot that flows from that.
One of my core takeouts out of today is about remaining open-minded and encouraging people to think about new experiences, new opportunities that are not just within the confines of your discipline, but reaching out and kind of like getting, I suppose, lateral growth from exposure in different sectors. Judge Henriques, we are unfortunately coming to the end of today's conversation. And one of the questions that I ask all my guests is about some of the factors that they feel have contributed to their success. So if you could share, what have been some of your core drivers?
Discipline, focus, my faith. And I also think it's the people that have been part of my life. My paternal grandmother, who wasn't educated, but valued education and insisted that we all be educated. Mother Teresa and her total dedication to helping the poor and people less fortunate than herself. My mother, who also similarly only had a standard 3 level of education, but who emphasized that sacrifice was worth it, that you had to have an education and that you always had to help others, those less fortunate than yourselves, even when they were reluctant to accept your help. And then also my best friend Naomi, who's a director of a major law firm. And I've watched her juggle her career as a director, as a managing director, and then as a mother and a daughter and a friend. And those have been people who've inspired me. And then also my family members who, as I was growing up, and even when I qualified, have kept me grounded, who said to me, yes, you may be an advocate, you may be an attorney, you may be a judge, but at the end of the day, you are a human being and you have to serve and you have to leave your mark in whatever small way you can. And when I was growing up, my grandmother said to me, it costs you nothing to smile at someone, because if they're having a bad day, you never know what that smile can mean to them and what a difference it can mean to them.
She sounded like a wise woman.
She was.
You've told us about some of the women in your life as role models, as influencers, from people that are near to you, family, friends, to externals like Mother Teresa. What would you like your legacy to be?
That I've made a difference, that I never turned anyone away when I could help, even in circumstances where they were too proud or unable to ask for help. And that when I couldn't help, I simply listened or was present in the moment with them. That's what I'd like my legacy to be.
Having an impact, and I think that speaks to purpose and service in life. Mm-hmm. Lastly, as we close out today's conversation in celebration of Women's Month, can you share a few words of inspiration that you'd like to pass on to girls and women who are listening to us?
Certainly. I've already said, persevere and never give up. Be strong in your faith. And there are words of Jillian Michaels which resonate with me, and I would like to share this with you and the listeners. She says, it's not about perfect, it's about effort. And when you implement that effort into your life every single day, that's where transformation happens. That's how change occurs. Keep going and remember why you started.
Very powerful words, and I think those are lessons for everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you so much for having me on the show.
You have been listening to Womanity-Women in Unity, and we have been talking to Judge Jacqueline Henriques, who is a permanent judge of the KwaZulu-Natal division of the High Court.